The quiet hum of the office building echoed around me as I made my way down the stairwell, escaping the bustle of my department. It was one of those days that seemed to drag on, where every email, every phone call felt like a weight pressing down on me. I just needed a moment alone, a breath away from it all. As I leaned against the cool concrete wall, letting the silence wash over me, I thought I was alone. But then, I heard footsteps. They were soft at first, echoing from the floor above, but as they grew louder, I recognized the distinct sound of his approach. My heart rate picked up as the footsteps descended, and before I could gather myself, he rounded the corner. It was Michael, my boss. He stopped in his tracks when he saw me, a faint look of surprise crossing his face. I had worked under him for almost a year, yet I still found it hard to get used to his presence. Tall, confident, and always impeccably dressed, he had a way of commanding attention with a single glance. The air shifted as he looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Taking a break?" he asked, his voice low but clear, carrying a hint of amusement. I managed a weak smile, feeling suddenly self-conscious. "Just needed a moment. It's been a long day." He nodded, his gaze steady, and took a step closer. "I understand. This place can be relentless sometimes." There was a pause, a moment where neither of us spoke, the only sound our breathing and the distant hum of the building. The stairwell felt unusually intimate, a secluded escape from the demands of the office, and I became acutely aware of his presence, the way his gaze seemed to linger a bit too long. "I didn't think anyone else ever came down here," I murmured, hoping to break the silence. He chuckled softly, crossing his arms as he leaned against the wall opposite me. "I guess we both had the same idea. Sometimes it's nice to step away from it all, isn't it?" I nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief that he understood. We'd had casual conversations in passing before, but this felt different, more personal. There was a warmth to his voice that I hadn't noticed before, a subtle gentleness beneath the authority he usually carried. "So," he said, his gaze holding mine, "what's been weighing on you today?" His question took me by surprise. I wasn't used to my boss asking me about my feelings, and I felt a twinge of embarrassment. "Oh, it's just the usual. Deadlines, reports, the constant barrage of emails." He nodded thoughtfully, his expression softening. "I know how that is. It can feel like you're drowning in it all." For a moment, there was something vulnerable in his eyes, a glimpse of the man beneath the professional facade. And in that instant, I felt a connection, a shared understanding that went beyond the formalities of the office. It was unexpected, unsettling even, but I couldn't deny the warmth that spread through me as we stood there, exchanging quiet words in the stillness of the stairwell. "It's good to know I'm not the only one who feels that way," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. His gaze lingered on me, a small, almost hesitant smile playing on his lips. "You're not alone. We're all just trying to keep up." Another silence settled between us, but this time, it was charged, heavy with an unspoken tension that seemed to wrap around us. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my palms growing clammy as his eyes held mine, refusing to let go. "I should probably get back to work," I murmured, breaking the silence, though a part of me didn't want to leave. He nodded slowly, but he didn't move. Instead, he reached out, his hand brushing lightly against my arm. The touch was brief, almost accidental, but it sent a shiver through me. His fingers lingered for a heartbeat too long before he pulled away, his gaze filled with something I couldn't quite read. "Take a few more minutes if you need them," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes a little space is all we need." With that, he turned and made his way back up the stairs, leaving me standing there, my heart racing, my mind reeling. The feel of his touch lingered on my skin, a quiet reminder of the brief moment we'd shared, a moment that had somehow left me breathless. Over the following days, I couldn't shake the memory of that encounter. I replayed it in my mind, analyzing every glance, every word, every touch. It was ridiculous, I told myself. He was my boss, and I was nothing more than an employee, one of dozens under his supervision. But the look in his eyes, the way he had lingered, had stirred something inside me, something I couldn't ignore. Our interactions became subtly charged, each meeting, each passing conversation filled with an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before. He would glance at me across the conference room, his gaze steady, intense, and I would feel my cheeks flush, a warmth spreading through me that I couldn't control. And when we spoke, his voice seemed softer, his words carrying a weight that felt too personal, too intimate. One afternoon, I was in the break room, pouring myself a cup of coffee, when I felt his presence behind me. I hadn't heard him approach, but I felt the shift in the air, the way the room seemed to grow smaller, the way my pulse quickened at the awareness of him standing so close. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice low and warm, sending a shiver down my spine. I turned to face him, my heart pounding as I managed a small nod. "Of course. It's nice to have company." He smiled, a hint of mischief in his eyes as he poured himself a cup. For a moment, we stood in silence, the only sound the soft clinking of our mugs as we stirred in sugar and cream. But the silence felt different, thick with an unspoken tension that made my skin tingle, my breath hitch. "You seemed a little distracted in the meeting earlier," he said, his gaze steady on mine. "Is everything all right?" I swallowed, feeling a flush rise to my cheeks. "Oh, just a lot on my mind." He nodded, his expression softening as he took a step closer. "If you ever need to talk, you know you can come to me. Sometimes, just saying things out loud can make them easier to handle." There was something in his voice, a warmth, a gentleness that made my heart ache. It was a side of him I hadn't seen before, a softness beneath the professionalism, and it left me feeling vulnerable, exposed in a way I hadn't expected. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I appreciate that." His gaze lingered on mine, a quiet intensity in his eyes that made my breath catch. And then, before I could process what was happening, he reached out, his hand brushing lightly against my arm, his touch warm, grounding. The moment felt suspended in time, a fragile connection between us, a line that neither of us dared to cross but couldn't seem to ignore. His hand lingered, his thumb brushing softly over my skin, and I felt my heart race, my pulse quickening as I met his gaze. "It's nothing," he murmured, his voice a whisper. But the look in his eyes told a different story, one filled with unspoken words, hidden emotions. We stood there, the world around us fading as we held each other's gaze, the connection between us deepening with each passing second. I knew it was wrong, knew that this was a line we couldn't cross, but in that moment, all I wanted was to stay there, to hold onto the warmth of his touch, the quiet intensity of his gaze. The next few days felt like a blur, every moment punctuated by fleeting glances and accidental touches that left me reeling. I'd catch his eye across the office, and he'd hold my gaze just a second longer than necessary, a silent acknowledgement of the connection we were trying so hard to ignore. And each time, my heart would race, a warmth spreading through me that I couldn't control. It was impossible to concentrate, knowing that he was just a few steps away, his presence filling every corner of my mind. Our conversations became layered with subtext, every word carrying an unspoken weight. I found myself waiting, hoping for those moments when we'd cross paths, just to feel the electric charge that sparked between us. One evening, as I was packing up my things, I heard the familiar sound of his footsteps approaching. My pulse quickened as I looked up, finding him standing in the doorway of my office, his gaze steady and unreadable. "Heading out?" he asked, his voice soft, but there was a hint of something more, a quiet intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. "Yes," I replied, struggling to keep my tone even. "Just finishing up for the day." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, and my heart skipped a beat. The silence was thick, charged, and as he looked at me, I felt the weight of his gaze, the unspoken words that hung between us. "I wanted to check in," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "You seemed distant in the last few meetings." The concern in his voice caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. I felt vulnerable, exposed, as though he could see right through me, see the feelings I'd been trying so hard to hide. "It's just been a lot lately," I replied, my voice trembling slightly. I'm trying to keep up, but... He took a step closer, closing the distance between us, and I felt my breath hitch. His gaze softened, and in that moment, I felt a connection that went beyond words, a quiet understanding that neither of us dared to voice. "You don't have to do it alone," he said, his hand reaching out to brush against mine, his touch warm, grounding. "If you ever need anything, I'm here." The sincerity in his voice made my heart ache, and before I could stop myself, I reached out, my fingers curling around his. It was a simple gesture, but the feel of his hand in mine, the warmth of his skin, sent a jolt through me. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't pull away, didn't break the contact. Instead, he held my gaze, his thumb brushing softly over my knuckles in a gesture that felt both comforting and dangerously intimate. I knew I should let go, knew that this was crossing a line we couldn't afford to cross, but I couldn't bring myself to pull away. The air between us grew heavier, the silence thick with unspoken words, and I felt my heart racing, my pulse quickening as he took a step closer, his gaze never leaving mine. I could feel the warmth radiating from him, the quiet intensity in his eyes that sent a thrill through me. "Maybe we should talk," he murmured, his voice a low, rough whisper that made my breath catch. "About whatever this is." I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, my heart pounding as I searched his gaze, trying to understand what he was feeling, what he wanted. Without another word, he took my hand, leading me toward the door. My heart raced as we made our way down the hall, each step filling me with both excitement and a growing sense of dread. I didn't know where we were going, didn't know what this would lead to, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. We reached the stairwell, the quiet, secluded space that had become our unspoken sanctuary, and he closed the door behind us. The silence was thick, the dim light casting soft shadows across his face as he looked at me, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of us spoke, the only sound our breaths, shallow and uneven. And then, before I could process what was happening, he reached out, his hand cupping my cheek as he looked into my eyes, his gaze filled with an intensity that took my breath away. "This is complicated," he murmured, his voice a mixture of hesitation and longing. I nodded, my heart pounding as I leaned into his touch, feeling the warmth of his hand against my skin. "I know." His thumb brushed softly over my cheek, a gentle caress that sent a shiver through me, and I felt my resolve crumbling, my carefully constructed walls beginning to fall apart. Every rational thought, every reason to stop, faded into the background as I looked into his eyes, seeing the same conflict, the same longing. Without another word, he leaned in, his lips brushing softly against mine in a kiss that was both tentative and full of unspoken promises. It was a question, a plea, and I answered it, my hands finding their way to his shoulders as I kissed him back, my heart racing as the connection between us deepened. The kiss grew more intense, filled with a passion that we'd both been holding back, a quiet desperation that had finally been set free. His hand slid down to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt a warmth spread through me, a feeling of completeness that I hadn't realized I'd been missing. We broke apart only when we were breathless, our foreheads resting together as we struggled to catch our breath. His hands lingered on my waist, his grip firm but gentle, and I looked up at him, seeing the same mixture of emotions that I felt mirrored in his eyes. This can't happen," he whispered, his voice filled with regret. I nodded, feeling a pang of guilt, of sadness, but I couldn't bring myself to pull away. Instead, I reached up, my hand cupping his cheek as I looked into his eyes, a silent plea for him to stay. "I know it's wrong," I murmured, my voice trembling. "But I don't want this to end." He closed his eyes, exhaling a shaky breath as he leaned into my touch, his hand covering mine. For a long moment, we stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, caught in a moment that felt both fragile and infinite. "I don't want it to end either," he whispered, his voice barely audible. And with that, he pulled me into another kiss, a kiss that was both tender and fierce, filled with a passion that left me breathless. His hands roamed over my back, pulling me closer, and I felt myself melting into him, surrendering to the connection that neither of us could deny. Time seemed to blur as we stood there in the quiet of the stairwell, our bodies pressed together, our breaths mingling in the small space between us. Each touch, each kiss felt like a promise, a silent declaration of everything we couldn't say out loud. But as the reality of our situation began to creep back in, I felt a wave of guilt wash over me, a painful reminder of the line we'd crossed. I pulled away, my heart heavy, my gaze dropping as I struggled to process the whirlwind of emotions that had taken hold of me. I don't know what this means, I whispered, my voice barely audible. He took a deep breath, his hand lifting to brush a strand of hair from my face. Neither do I, he admitted, his gaze filled with a quiet sadness. But I know I don't want to lose this, whatever this is. A part of me wanted to believe him, to hold on to the hope that we could find a way through this, but the weight of our actions loomed large, a shadow that neither of us could ignore. As he looked at me, his eyes filled with longing, regret, and something deeper, I knew that we were standing on the edge of something we couldn't easily come back from. And though the future was uncertain, though the road ahead was fraught with challenges, a part of me couldn't help but hope that somehow we could find a way to make this work. The days that followed were a delicate, painful balance of restraint and desire, a constant push and pull that neither of us seemed able to control. Each glance across the office, each accidental touch, sent a thrill through me, but it also reminded me of the line we'd crossed, the line we kept crossing every time we allowed ourselves to meet alone, hidden away from the world. There were moments when I caught him watching me, a quiet intensity in his gaze, a question in his eyes that left me breathless. And each time, I would feel that same longing, the same urge to bridge the distance between us, to lose myself in the warmth of his arms once more. But there was always the weight of guilt, the shadow of consequences that loomed over us, keeping us tethered to the lives we'd built outside of this stolen connection. One evening, as I was wrapping up for the day, I felt his presence behind me, a familiar warmth that made my heart race. I turned to find him standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. I nodded, my throat tight as I gathered my things and followed him. He led me back to the stairwell, our unspoken sanctuary, and as we stood there in the quiet, I felt the tension between us, thick and suffocating. He leaned against the wall, his gaze focused on the ground as he took a deep breath. "I don't know how much longer we can keep doing this," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't keep pretending that everything is normal." The vulnerability in his voice cut through me, and I felt my chest tighten as I looked at him. "I know," I whispered, my voice trembling, "but I don't know how to stop." He looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of longing and regret. "Neither do I." For a moment, we stood there in silence, the weight of our situation pressing down on us. And then, as if drawn by some invisible force, he took a step closer, his hand reaching out to brush against my cheek. The touch was soft, a gentle caress that made my heart ache, and as I looked into his eyes, I knew that whatever happened next, there would be no going back. "I need you to know something," he murmured, his gaze steady on mine. What we've shared, it's real for me." Tears pricked at my eyes as I took in his words, the sincerity in his voice, the raw emotion in his gaze. "It's real for me too," I whispered, my voice breaking. He pulled me into his arms, holding me close as I let my emotions spill over, my heart aching with the knowledge that this moment, this connection, couldn't last. We stood there, wrapped in each other's embrace, clinging to the fragile hope that somehow we could find a way to make this work. But as the days passed, reality began to creep back in, casting shadows over our stolen moments. The guilt grew heavier, the burden of our secret weighing down on us both. We started to pull back, our interactions growing more distant, each of us trying to protect ourselves from the inevitable end. One afternoon, as I was leaving a meeting, I found him waiting for me in the hallway. There was a sadness in his eyes, a resignation that made my heart sink, and I knew, without him saying a word, that our time together was running out. "Can we talk?" he asked softly, his voice filled with a quiet sorrow. I nodded, my throat tight as I followed him back to the stairwell. We stood in silence for a long moment, neither of us wanting to be the first to speak, both of us knowing that this conversation would change everything. He took a deep breath, his gaze steady on mine. "I don't regret any of this," he murmured, his voice trembling slightly. "But I can't keep doing this to us." I felt a tear slip down my cheek, and I reached out, my hand finding his, holding on to him for one last time. "I understand," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "But I don't regret it either." We stood there, holding each other's hands, our connection silent but profound, both of us mourning the loss of what could have been. And as we shared one final embrace, one last kiss filled with all the love and longing we couldn't put into words, I knew that this would be our goodbye. As I walked away, leaving him behind in the stairwell, my heart felt heavy, a hollow ache that I knew would take time to heal. But there was also a sense of peace, a quiet understanding that what we'd shared, though fleeting, was real, was worth the heartache. And though the future was uncertain, though the pain of our parting was sharp and unforgiving, I knew that a part of him would stay with me, a quiet reminder of a love that defied the boundaries of our everyday lives. In the end, we returned to our separate worlds, our lives moving forward as though nothing had changed. But deep down, we both knew the truth, that we had shared something beautiful, something unforgettable. And even though our paths would no longer cross, the memory of our time together would remain, a bittersweet reminder of the love we had found and the price we had paid to let it go.